Today's lucky numbers are 4, 6, 8, 3, 1.
Welcome to the A&P Professor, a few minutes to focus on teaching human anatomy and physiology with host Kevin Patton.
In this episode, I revisit the number of human genes, I discuss a newly discovered sensory structure in the gut, and we have a chat with media expert Barbara Waxer. A recent article in Science News talked about the number of genes in the human genome being around 46,831, which is more than twice the number I gave not so long ago in episode 20, when I said that researchers were saying that there were about 21,306 genes in the human genome. So what's going on there? We suddenly found way more genes? No, not really. It's actually based on the same work, or at least a continuation of the same work. And this newer number, the larger number, is a combination of the protein coding genes and the non-coding genes, many of which are coding for those long RNAs that we know are being made in the cell and being used for a variety of purposes. And besides that, there are also some non-coding genes not included in that number that code for the microRNAs and other kinds of small RNAs that we're just now kind of figuring out what they are and what they do. And so when you combine all of that together, you get this larger number. So last I heard, and people can call in or email me and correct me, but the last published number I've seen was back in August, and it's 21,306 for protein coding genes. And at that time, they said there were 21,856 non-coding genes. And there were a total number of transcripts that they had identified at well over 300,000. So those numbers, it looks like, are still kind of standing, but this new article emphasizes a couple of things that I think it's important for us as teachers who are covering this information need to think about and need to be aware of. One is, how do you define a gene? And some people who actually work in genetics and do genomics and so on, they're going to use sort of the traditional method of calling a gene a protein coding section of the DNA code. And they're not going to be considering those non-coding sections to be genes. But more and more, and probably mostly these days, they're calling them all genes. So maybe that's what we should be thinking about. So when we want to talk about those genes that dictate protein structure, then we can call them coding genes or protein coding genes, to be clear. And then when we talk about those that are coding for the RNAs, then we can call them non-coding genes. And then together we can say all genes. So this is mostly not going to come up in our A&P course, at least not as a big, long discussion. Or maybe it will. I don't know. I think it would be an interesting discussion. But as an A&P teacher, I think we need to know about these distinctions and know about the trends, and also know that we still don't have a final number. So keep your eyes out. I'll keep my eyes out. If you run across something, let me know, because I want to know what the latest number is. I think it's interesting. And it is important to know what that number is. And I think we're going to see a lot of changes in that number for the non-coding genes, because, as I say, that's kind of a newer area of explanation within the human genome. I'll have links to all this in the show notes and on the episode page. I want to tell you a short little story about a new type of sensory structure that has been discovered in the mammalian body. They're called neuropod cells. And this story begins with another kind of sensory structure that we're all familiar with because it's in our A&P books, and we probably at least mention it in our class. And that is the structure of the skin for light pressure, called the Merkel cell, tactile disc, Merkel disc, tactile meniscus. And it's a sensory cell that synapses with an epithelial cells in the epidermis of the skin. The epithelial cell is often called the tactile epithelial cell. The sensory neuron that synapses with that epithelial cell would then be called the tactile disc or Merkel disc. And you can probably kind of picture it in your mind's eye right now. And we know that a bunch of other sensory apparatuses in the body are formed by a synapse between an epithelial cell and the sensory neuron. For example, the rods and cones in the eye that synapse with sensory neuron. We have the taste buds, the epithelial cells of the taste buds synapsing with the neural network. And so when we get to the gut, we find that there is a structure that has just been identified that works pretty much the same way, or at least it looks like it. And the cells, the epithelial cells that are involved, are cells that we've known about for a long time. They're usually called enteroendocrine cells. So these are cells that are detecting changes in the lumen of the digestive tract, and they send out some hormonal signals, and that all helps in this big, complicated mechanism of regulating the gut during the process of digestion and absorption and so on. And what has recently been mapped out is the fact that these enteroendocrine cells actually act like those tactile epithelial cells in that they also synapse with a neuron, a sensory neuron. In much the same way, the diagrams look kind of similar, to me at least. So what are these cells doing and why are they there? Let me just mention a little bit about these cells. One thing is the name. Neuropod cells is the newly proposed name. Whether that's going to stick or not, time will tell. But they're basically the neuroendocrine cells. So if you talk about those in your class, you might want to mention that, well, hey, we just discovered something new about them. We find that not only do they secrete hormones that are going to act on a little bit longer term, they also secrete short-acting neurotransmitters, specifically glutamate and serotonin, and they form the synapse with these sensory cells that can very quickly get a message to the brain about what's going on in the lumen of the digestive tract. So what is this sensory information going back to the brain? Well, what's being proposed is that this information might include information about what we're eating, the sugars, the lipids, the proteins, and also maybe even some signaling about what kind of microbes are there, what kind of interactions with microbes our body is having. All kinds of things are possible. But as usual with these kinds of discoveries, there's just a lot we don't know yet. These are all sort of proposed functions. So go to the show notes or the episode page, and there are links to some other information about this, and dive into it and look at what they found and see what you think. By the way, I do have a sloppy little picture of this new sensory structure on the podcast page and in the show notes. Feel free to use that in your class for teaching if you like. In past episodes, discussions have come up regarding the use of images and other media in our A&P course, whether it's on a live or recorded presentation, in course handouts, or other course content. I'll have a link to those episodes in the show notes and in the episode page at theapprofessor.org. As I've said, I think there's a lot of confusion about what we can and cannot use legally in our teaching, what the best practices are, and even how we can get started finding helpful media to use in teaching. And, as I've mentioned, I've asked my friend Barbara Waxer to join us to help us begin the process of understanding some of the issues surrounding the use of media in our teaching. Barbara is a national speaker on copyright and media. She teaches media arts at Santa Fe Community College, and she's written dozens of books and digital products, including Internet Surf and Turf Revealed, The Essential Guide to Copyright, Fair Use, and Finding Media. Sounds like that's exactly who we should be talking to, right? Barbara, it's always great chatting with you, and I've learned so much from you over the years, and actually even just a few minutes ago, about finding and using media. Thank you so much for agreeing to join our conversation.
Kevin, it's always a pleasure.
Let's just start with the big question we all have. In terms of media, what can I legally use in my classroom to teach? Well, besides my own original work.
Well, as long as we use that magic term legally, which actually we would say properly, there are no limits, which is a great thing to say. Here's the caveat. Provided you know how to find and use that work properly. So one of the things that I think we can have as a takeaway from this is how A&P instructors can find work that already says yes to use. And by that, what we're talking about are licenses that are open, such as Creative Commons and other sites like that. And sometimes it could just mean giving credit. Sometimes it means you might have to pay a little bit for a license. But our assumption, and this is the hard part because we're so used to consuming all sorts of media, the assumption has to be if you're doing a search on the internet for media, that stuff you have to assume is going to be copyright protected.
So does it matter whether I'm teaching in a face-to-face class or in an online course?
There are differences because there are different laws that govern face-to-face over online. And in online, those of us who teach online must adhere to something called the Teach Act. And that has very specific compliance requirements for both the educational institution and for the instructor. And that differs a little bit from face-to-face. And that's because when we place our works in Canvas and Blackboard, wherever we're placing our materials for our students, that's considered publishing, and that has a different meaning in online work.
Wow, okay. Well, that's good to know. Are there different rules governing still images and video?
Nah, that's still all considered part of creative work, and copyright covers the creative arts, literary, photography, music, dance, computer code. All that is considered creative stuff. That's all covered by copyright. So the type, the flavor really doesn't matter.
So I guess it's okay to use images from the textbook I'm using because they're provided by the publisher for that purpose. Does that mean that I can use them any way I want? Like, like publishing copies of my PowerPoint presentations in a course pack, or maybe in SlideShare or somewhere else on the web?
Oh, yeah, that's a loaded question, isn't that? So here's the deal. You and I have both been authors under traditional publishing contracts. And this really depends. Now we're moving away from copyright law. We're moving away from the Teach Act, what governs what we can do as online instructors, into the terribly exciting world of contract law. And this has to do with the licensing agreements that the publisher gives us when we adopt a book. And that's really specific. So for example, we're used to seeing, instructor resources. Sometimes publishers will provide quiz banks or online resources such as lecture notes or even PowerPoint using their own work. That all we have no problem using. The bottom line is, once you adopt a book, whether you've read the terms or not, you've agreed to them. And that's also true when you install an app or a software or land on a web page. There are de facto things that you've agreed to, whether or not you've ever seen them.
Wow. Okay. Well, I know.
Now, but you mentioned course packs, so let me talk about that. Unless you had a follow up real quick.
No. That's fine.
Okay, course packs can be problematic. There have been major Supreme Court cases of instructors who took a chapter here, some media there, put it all together in a course pack, and never paid for that use to the source publisher or author or whatever. That actually became a Supreme Court case and involved the University of Michigan. That was a biggie. You can't just cobble together stuff, put it in a course pack and say, hey, no problem. However, there is a different way of looking at it, especially if you work with your local librarian, if you create e-reserves. And that's really dependent on your educational institution and absolutely engaging your institutional librarian as an ally. First off, they have incredible knowledge. Secondly, that's what they're predisposed to do, is to provide access to information.
So, like, and that would include like posting like various places on the web and that too. Like if I post it to SlideShare for everybody to use, but I'm using the publisher's material.
Yeah, it's a great question. And as our attorney friends love to say, it depends. And what you first need to look at is if that licensing agreement, when you adopt a book, you need to make sure that they don't explicitly say you can only use this in, your learning management system for this class. They know, of course, now we have to look into a different aspect of what I like to call the politics of reality. People are placing, conference slide decks, which is what I do a lot, other slide decks, in SlideShare, in other platforms. And of course, that's going to have, source material from, let's say, an academic publisher. The first thing, and it's onerous and it's not real fun, it's not the sexy part of teaching, is look what's in that licensing agreement. If they explicitly say, do not use this unless it's related to this class, you're now setting up a risk analysis. And that depends how you feel about risk.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. So so just, thinking of a scenario here. Let's say I use the publisher's images and I put that in my PowerPoints, and I know I can do that. And I use that for my class. And then I tell my class, well, I'm going to post this on SlideShare and here's the link, or some other place that anyone can access. My intent is for this to be for my own students. But again, in the real world, anybody who's in, let's say, SlideShare or any of these other places where you can post stuff. And so I do a search for, the function of the nephron in the kidney. And so up pops my presentation with my textbook images on there. Now it's really being accessed everywhere. So we need to kind of analyze the risk. Is that what you're saying? That, well, what are the odds that somebody else is going to find it and that I'm going to get in trouble for this? Or
yeah, it's problematic. Why is it problematic? Because we don't know what your permission is to use those images, because we don't know what that agreement is. That's the ideology of it.
Right.
Now, the risk is the publisher going to find your SlideShare, come back to you, get you and your institution in trouble? At the very minimum, they'll probably just say, pull it.
Right.
But that's why it's important to understand, well, what are they letting me do to begin with?
Sure.
And absent information does not mean it's permission. It just, it really truly is. We can look at it like a risk analysis.
Okay.
Who doesn't love SlideShare? You see all sorts of material there. Clearly, there's not copyright police from publishers or other content producers scouring that as they do, for example, YouTube, if you're a record company.
Right. But I don't know, it could be like the traffic cops. They always seem to find me. Everybody goes speeding by, but they find me.
Actually, that's a great example. The example I use in class is you have a broken taillight. You're driving the car. How would you know you have a broken taillight? And they pull you over, and what they say is, well, you're responsible for the maintenance of your vehicle at all times. So you're supposed to somehow know if you have a broken taillight.
Wow. Yeah. Well, kind of circling back just a little bit, to this keeps coming up. What is our license or permission that we get from the publisher to use this stuff? And I do know that stuff I've recently downloaded to use in a class from a publisher, it actually popped up with a little box that gave me some guidance on what I can and can't do. It probably wasn't as detailed as I'd like it to be now that I've talked to you, but it did give me some guidance. But that, I know that doesn't always happen. So if I have a question about, well, what can I legally use or not use, then probably the best thing for me to do would be to contact whoever is my contact at the publisher. That's usually a rep assigned to my school. And I ask them, you know, what are the limitations here? What kind of license do I have? And then they should be able to get that for me or point me in the right direction, don't you think?
I think that's true for some, but based on their job description, which is sales rep, they're probably not going to be having the kind of in-depth knowledge on the question that you're asking. One alternative, or maybe someone on the same parallel path, again, would be to engage a librarian who is used to reading that kind of language. They do that all the time for online subscriptions for the library, and getting them to go through it with you and looking at the built-in exception to copyright protection, which is called fair use. There are 4 factors that we weigh to determine whether something leans for or against fair use. And librarians are the ones who I think can be our best allies on that. Because the fact that something has copyright protection does not automatically mean we can't use it. We just have to look at different ways that we can. Is there a specific exception in the law that will govern my specific use? Is there a different license I can get? Is my use fair use? All these kinds of questions. At the very end, I think, should be, do I need to get permission and pay for it?
Well, I'm glad you have brought up a couple times now the librarian, because this might just be me, but it seems like, and this has happened at several different schools, whenever I go to the librarian with this or other kinds of questions that are teaching related, they seem to just get a big smile on their face and take me by the hand and sit me down, and we have a nice long conversation about it. They seem to really enjoy this kind of work. So my initial trepidation about, I don't want to bother them with this, they're probably busy, it's a dumb question, I should already know this. My experience has been just the opposite. Like, oh my gosh, more instructors need to be coming and having this conversation with me. I'm so glad you did. How can I help you?
I couldn't agree more. I think some of it is for us as instructors to look at our own bias. If we associate the word librarian with, I love reading books too, that's not a contemporary definition. I think more, I'm going to go to my librarian. Why? Because I know he or she totally is up on information systems. I know they know completely how to do a critical evaluation of sources, and they have more experience in reading this dense legal language than I do.
That's a good point. And I guess, I was going to ask about this, but, again, maybe a librarian can help me work this out in my own specific case, but just in general. If I change textbooks, so I'm using the images from a particular textbook and a particular publisher, and let's say the next year I'm teaching the same course, but now I've changed to a different textbook, different publisher, but I have all of these slides I've already made, and I don't want to remake them all, at least not right away, or there are certain images that the new book just doesn't have, and I really like the old image. Can I keep using those older publisher images?
I know that I think we all have been in that same position. Love the new book, but man, this quiz from chapter 4 was better. Or like you say, I like the way they depicted this image better than the other. And again, it comes back to, let's just look at it. Okay, you got publisher A and you got publisher B. Great. You're now adopting publisher B's book. Why would publisher A want you to still use their material? What are they getting from you? Nothing. It's just a dollars and cents argument. why would anyone want you to use something for free if you're no longer adopting their book?
Well, that's a good point.
I mean, to just start on that as your basic thing, it's like, now, moving on from that, what's the reality of teaching? We want to provide the best materials we can access to our students. And there, again, your licensing agreement, we know what it says. It says, hey, if you're no longer adopting the book, see ya, right? Okay. We're going to, for example, we no longer have access to the Instructor Resources online site. You know, if you switch from Pearson to Cengage, Pearson's going to cut you off. You can't see your stuff anymore. If you ever posted anything, if your students ever did anything, you no longer have access to what Pearson provided. That should be a first clue.
Yeah, that's a good clue. And I guess part of this comes down to something that has come up in a previous episode on this podcast, and that is ethics and best practice. And so, you know, I think I need to ask myself questions of, yeah, maybe I can get away with this. Maybe they won't find me and I can still continue to use this. But is that the kind of ethical behavior I want to model to my students? And as you know, our students are headed into health professions. They're going to be taking care of me someday. They are going to be taking care of my family. And I don't want them to have been taught that it's okay to not do things in an ethical way, in a legal way. So I want to model that for them. And so that's why I'm talking to you. I want to get some answers on what is the right way to do things and where are the points where there are risks. And, you know, you're giving us a lot of good information, but also telling us that we have a guide that is always available to us, and that is our library staff.
Absolutely.
And speaking of our librarians, one thing that you mentioned that I think is also one of the first questions people have when they talk about using various images and so on in their teaching is, how and where do I start looking for images and other media like video clips and so on that I can use in my teaching?
That's a great point. And with A&P, there's a particular need because you have technology that's so transformed this community that we know you can find, you know, wonderful illustrations. Granted, they're from the 1800s that we know are in the public domain, meaning they no longer have any copyright protection attached to them. But we know that our students want much more engaging material. Motion graphics, video, and things like that. It's considered relatively niche in terms of Google searching, but let me talk about a couple things. One is, as a great, easy takeaway, we need to refine how we do our Google searches. By that, I mean, at a minimum, if you're, and we know a lot of folks, hey, I'm just doing something real quick. Let me just search under Google Images. Is it here? I've downloaded it. I'm done. As we know, the assumption has to be that that work was protected. You've now downloaded something and are using it, not even knowing if you have permission and probably doing it improperly, which is called copyright infringement. Now, if we just refine our search, where under Google Images, you do your search for whatever you want, you know, a hip joint or whatever, and then under Tools, and then you click Usage Rights, there's an option labeled for reuse with modification. That at least filters out anywhere from 75 to 95% of the stuff that you can't use. You still need to, this is how I teach this, you have to do due diligence. It's not a perfect search algorithm, but at least just looking at Tools, Usage Rights, labeled for reuse with modification. And by that modification element means, hey, I want to crop it. Maybe I want to, you know, do something else, put something over it. Great. You've modified it. That at least will give you a pretty good pool to start swimming in. And then if you also add to your search term the term public domain, and again, public domain means there's no copyright protection attached to that work. What you're going to pull up is first stuff to ignore, which is anything from Pinterest. That's a different conversation. Just trust me on this one. Do not ever go to Pinterest as a source. But what you will find is an emphasis on organizations that have already done the work for us, such as universities, local and state government, and photo sharing platforms that encourage and demand that users attach an open access license to their work, such as Flickr. And just doing that this morning, as I was preparing for our chat here, I found a great bevy of images from different universities, particularly the University of Michigan and several others, where again, you know that you're starting in a pool that's already a lot safer. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. So
same with YouTube, by the way, and you can search for Creative Commons on YouTube, and we can talk about that in a little bit.
What you're saying is that instead of doing my usual search of quick and dirty, I need a nephron in the kidney. I need, a different image of a nephron in the kidney that I want to use in my PowerPoint presentation. And so that's what I usually do is I just go to Google, type in nephron, kidney, something like that, and get a bajillion things and just pick the best one, and I'm done. But what you're saying is that best practice is to add a little layer to make my search just a tiny bit more sophisticated by limiting what pops up in the screen to those things that are likely to be maybe in the public domain or have a Creative Commons license or something. So now instead of wading through, 2.3 billion images, I'm now down to 500 million images, but these are more likely to be safer. And then I find one I like, and then I look a little closer at it to see, well, what is the permission that's there? What is the copyright status of it? And then, I can decide whether I want to use it or not and what the risks are and so on. So am I understanding what you're saying correctly?
Yeah, pretty much. But when you put public domain into that search term, and so many of the results come from universities who have large medical schools, they've done a lot of work for us already. We're now tapping into their levels of protection, their levels of expertise. So if you're going to Harvard or Stanford, the University of Michigan, or pick your favorite large medical school, and you are into their batch of images, that's really, really raises the bar where I'm feeling pretty good wading into that pool. And the question is not so much, can I use it, but rather, how do I attribute my use? How do I give credit to the author? And there, and again, universities and also government. So NIH, for example, has an awesome bevy of photos and motion graphics and video. The real question is, now that I know that I can use it, hey, I want to give credit to the author, to the photographer, whoever it is. And that's the information that they can give you is cool, courtesy, whoever. And that's the easy part.
Okay. And so you're bringing up something that has come up in a previous episode, and that is this idea of giving credit for work that's not our own. And whether we're required to do that or not still gets back to, is it the ethical thing to do? Is it the right thing to do? And the way this came up was that, we were talking about plagiarism, and do students really understand what plagiarism is, that they really do need to give credit when they're quoting someone else. And I made the point that sometimes they don't really understand what plagiarism is. And I think it complicates things for our students when they see us using other people's work and not having any kind of citation as to where that came from. And,
absolutely.
So I'm not being a good model for my students. And so I get on their case if I run across, a quote that wasn't cited, or an image or something that they're using in a report or another assignment, and they haven't credited it. They haven't told me what the source is at the minimum, much less whether, it's something that they're able to use, which usually they are, but there's no citation there. Well, if I'm not doing it, then how can I expect them to do it? Not only that, it helps me. So that when I'm going back through my materials, I know where I got stuff. I know where it came from. And if I ever, for some reason, need to go back to that source, I know where to go, where it's, because my my brain is becoming less and less likely to be able to pull that stuff out of my memory.
Well, and also, I teach writing for mass media and the web, where epistemology, understanding, how do I know that? How can I trust this source, especially with some people with some truly incredible Photoshop skills, who can just do amazing digital manipulation. Attribution is an awesome best practice. And when we talk a little bit about plagiarism, it usually is associated with written works. And what we're saying is, I'm referencing this in my material. I'm not saying I wrote it. So that plagiarism is not a great applicability to images, because no one is saying, I took this photo with my $10,000 camera and microscope if I'm doing, cytology or something. So it's a different thing. Plagiarism is saying, I did not create it. Copyright is saying, I'm using it properly. And that's a distinction I think we need to make. Attribution of an image or a motion graphic or video has nothing to do with saying, I have permission to use it in the first place. All you're saying is, I didn't create it, and it's into a different realm.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So, you've given us some starting points. Like University of Michigan has some images that I might be able to use. NIH has images I might be able to use. So, how do I find where those places are?
Like I say, I think just first off, as you know, this is a passion of mine. On my website, I have over 750 photo sites, 3,000 sites total, that reference sites on the web that already say yes. And they say yes because their contributors have committed to either an open access license like Creative Commons, or a relatively new Creative Commons license that's called CC0, where it's public domain. It's the photographer saying, I love this. You know what? I don't need any credit. You can use it however you want. So with my site, which is www.barbarawaxer.com, BARBARAWAXER, that's one source, but that's for everything. I think it really is going to go back for A&P folks to refining that Google search and putting public domain as part of your search term, so that, and the reason I say that is because that's how our friends in other large universities and state and local governments and federal government will catalog. We want to tap into the metadata of how these other folks are capturing their data and how they're tagging their data. And public domain is going to be a great term.
Okay. And as you were explaining that, I was just thinking, this is something else I can ask my school librarian about, and they can help me locate sources, right?
Oh, absolutely. Specifically for A&P, that's a finesse. I think that's such a specialty, but absolutely they can. Absolutely. And let me just put this out there for your colleagues. If you're really stuck on something, contact Kevin and he'll contact me, and I'll be glad to help you.
Sounds great. Well, I appreciate that.
You bet.
Barbara, I appreciate so much you taking the time to talk to us today. This is a topic that has come up numerous times, and I think a lot of us that are out there teaching, we really don't have much background into how we should be doing things and what the best practices are. And I'm going to have a link in the show notes and on the episode page at theapprofessor.org, where I'll have Barbara's website, and I'll have, maybe a couple other resources to get you started. And of course, the strong advice to sit down with your librarian and have a chat with them and clarify some of the things that you have. And if you have any further questions, go ahead and contact me at podcast@theapprofessor.org, or call the podcast hotline at 1-833-LION-DEN. And, maybe we can get Barbara back here sometime to answer some follow-up questions. And once again, thank you so much for helping us today, Barbara. And I'll be talking to you again soon.
You bet. This was awesome. Thanks again.
The A&P Professor is hosted by Kevin Patton, professor, blogger, and textbook author in human anatomy and physiology.
Please remove the battery from this episode before packing it in your luggage.